Have you ever wondered how fiction mirrors reality, especially when it comes to something as serious as domestic violence? Well, today I'm breaking down the movie adaptation of It Ends With Us as a trauma therapist. And I want to focus specifically on Ryle's red flags. These red flags often go unnoticed in relationships. This isn't just about analyzing the movie, it's about recognizing the signs of abuse in real life. Now, if you've been following some of the promotion of the movie, I do want to acknowledge that there has been quite a lot of controversy, both about the author and about the producer director. I don't want to get too much into gossip and hearsay because the criticism has been that some of the marketing approaches have sort of minimized the message of the movie. So I definitely don't want to replicate that, but just to say, I think it is a microcosm of what has been happening in the world. And so, what I really wanted to center this particular video on is recognizing the warning symptoms. Now, I want to say that the only person that can prevent abuse is the abuser. I stand by that 100%. I do believe in harm reduction, and that's what I want to do today because anytime in my past 15 years of being a victim advocate, a rape prevention researcher, an EMDR and trauma therapist, I've seen firsthand and helped women heal the wounds of trauma and abuse. There is a playbook, and I always comment because when I start asking people questions, did they do this? Did they do this? They go, how did you know that? And it is because there is a particular cycle that goes on with this type of abuse. And so I do feel like education, wisdom is power. And so I want to arm you with the power to recognize the red flags early. Because often what happens, and what I think they do a really good job with the book, is showing that people fall in love and then they're blinded by love. And then if there's really good sex involved, the pleasure is the drug. And then the high and the lows are the drug. And so just to say, it's really easy to kind of get caught in a cycle of that. And it can happen to anyone. Knowing what the signs are can be super helpful so that you can recognize them at the beginning of the relationship, hopefully before you get in too deep or before you fall in love with that person. A quick side note, I am a therapist, but I'm not your therapist. This is meant for educational and entertainment purposes only. So let's kind of go play by play. Now, just to be fair, I particularly loved the movie. I know it's a polarizing topic, it's a polarizing author, it's a polarizing book, movie, right? So part of me was nervous even to take this on, but just to say that I watched the movie not having read the book. I'm about halfway through the book. I'm at the scene where, spoilers. Let me give a spoiler warning. Spoilers. Definitely. But I'm at the scene where she's been assaulted and she runs into him at the restaurant. So just for context, I'm about halfway through. I can see, actually, right after I saw the movie, I went to buy the book and I talked to a lady and she said they glossed over quite a lot of the intensity and depth of the abuse in the book. So I think just in general, for those of you who maybe didn't like the book or didn't like the movie, I just think the book's always better than the movie. So there's an inherent bias there. But I'm doing this partly as blind to the full experience of the book as well. But let's get into it. Let's see what the red flags are. Okay. So the first one is controlling behavior. So some examples of this are a lot of checking behaviors, in the day of technology, a lot of tracking. You might think, yeah, I have my partner on Life 360 or whatever that app is. That's just normal. Most people do that. And that can be a good safety prevention sort of thing. But it also can be controlling behavior. Often there is some jealousy, and often there can be conflict around what a partner wears or who they talk to or where they can go. And so this kind of controlling behavior, I think a lot of times people will feel like, oh, that person really loves me. And they sort of see that jealousy or possessiveness as a compliment when really it's a sign of abuse. Feeling like you have to check in constantly, walking on eggshells, having to ask permission before making decisions. These are all red flags. One of the criticisms in the book was that the characters were much younger in real life. So I can tell you, in real life, in the book, I can tell you that this kind of thing can happen at any age. I do think that teenagers and college age folks are probably more susceptible to it because they're newer at relationships. And I think that this controlling behavior can kind of be seen as more courting behavior, but we need to really call it what it is. It's controlling. So if you find that your partner is controlling, that is a whopping red flag. Okay. That's why I'm an entrepreneur. I don't want anyone to control me. Okay. Controlling behavior is such a turnoff for me. So hopefully now that you know that, it may be a turnoff for you too. The second one is isolation. So this is a really key one, and it often happens early on. The partner deliberately distances you from friends, family, support systems. For example, in the book and the movie, he immediately wants to meet her mom. Okay, so I'm going to be a little stereotypical here, but do most guys want to meet the parents? No. So I think that that could feel flattering. Oh, my partner loves me so much. They want to meet my mom right away. But I would say in general, rushing the relationship, especially past your comfort point, is a big red flag. But the isolation piece can happen where they sort of turn you against friends and family, particularly if those friends and family feel protective of you. And so if, for example, the person who's being hurt starts to confide in someone, the normal reaction, and I've had this happen not only with clients, but with friends as well, you want to protect the person that you love, right? But then often that actually makes them go deeper into the abusive relationship because they realize they can't tell you what's really going on without you having what I would say is a normal concern, right? But signs of this can be guilt tripping you for spending time with others or creating conflict that drive you away from loved ones. Now, this is sort of the flip side of isolation, but I feel like it's a little hybrid. Often I do find that manipulative abusers will start to talk to the friends, to the family member to kind of turn their ear. Whereas, if you just started dating someone, like, why are they talking to your mom? That's just not usually how it goes. But it's like they want the in because they can kind of start manipulating and controlling through that. So the third one is emotional manipulation. The partner uses guilt, shame, fear to control you, often making you feel responsible for their emotions. And so oftentimes the person who's being hurt will want to leave, but feels responsible for the other person or feels like they won't be okay without me. And so a lot of times someone who is the victim of domestic violence can get into the kind of this enabling role because they've just been hammered with the guilt, shame, and fear. And so a lot of times they take responsibility for things that they should not be. So even though an abuser might be abusive, they often convince the victim that it's their fault. And so signs of this are feeling like you're walking on eggshells. Okay, if there's one book that I recommended over and over, it's the Stop Walking on Eggshells book. So that is a book about borderline personality, but I think that does a good job about hitting some of these dynamics. Obviously not, often I feel people with BPD are victims of abuse rather than abusers, so don't get that twisted. But just to say, I think there can be a similar dynamic in the sense of just getting you, it's sort of like the Stockholm syndrome, right? So feeling like you're in charge of keeping the peace. The fourth sign is jealousy and possessiveness. This, again, often can come off for people as flattering, but for a novice or for someone who's maybe a little naive to this, but really these can include accusations of cheating or flirting without cause, become jealous. And this is kind of what happens in the book when Atlas resurfaces in her life, her childhood sweetheart, which there's a little bit of, you can see where her caretaker patterns began, both with her parents, since they were in a domestic interpersonal violence situation, then, taking Atlas in when he was homeless. And luckily, it was sort of a positive experience, but there is that age discrepancy there. It does sort of set the selfless caretaking piece in motion. And so a lot of times abusers can have unjustified suspicion, constant questioning, and monitoring. And a lot of times when someone feels jealous, they feel like they're going to lose their relationship. And so this can definitely be a sign of controlling behavior. Okay, so like the bottom line of all of these warning signs is control. If you don't feel like you can do what you need to do, that is a big red flag. The next one is verbal abuse. This is where partners use insults, put downs, name calling to demean you. And this is actually a very strategic piece. A lot of times, abusers want to wear down your self esteem so that you won't leave. Okay. And often there is an intergenerational piece, both for victims and abusers. And so often they're just replicating generational trauma that they've experienced. Certainly not to excuse any of that, but just to say that if you've lived through that as a child, it's more likely to happen as an adult. But this verbal abuse is very intentional in the sense that it causes the person to stay because of diminished self-esteem, feeling worthless, or constantly doubting your worth. And I've helped many people divorce in both unhealthy relationships and healthy relationships as clients. And it's such a hard decision to divorce or to leave a relationship. When I was a DBT therapist, we talked about ending destructive relationships. And that is the hardest skill of all because a lot of times the things that make you a good partner, like being loyal, like being empathic, like caring for someone, also can be what makes you stay too long in an unhealthy situation. So just know that some of these emotional manipulation, the jealousy, the verbal abuse, they really play together to weaken the person's resolve and keep them in this unhealthy situation. The next one is physical violence or even threats of physical violence. So there's definitely an intimidation factor here. So it could be that the partner hits, pushes, threatens to harm you. And not just you, it could be pets, it could be other people you care about, children. And so these can be very intense. I think they do a really good job of this in the book because the first experience of abuse is when Ryle, who's a neurosurgeon, burns his hand and he makes the mistake of not putting a glove on. So really it's sort of his fault that he didn't do that. But because it's such an awkward moment and she starts laughing, and laughing at the worst times is a trauma response. That is a thing that happens often. And then that's when he sideswipes her. So I do think, and then to be fair, I don't know. Y'all, I cried through the whole movie. So now that I'm reading the book, it's blending a little bit. So it's definitely kind of an emotional mind when I watch the movie. So I don't know if they exactly portrayed this in the movie or if it was just in the book. But I do know in the book, because I just read this scene, she pushes him and he cuts his hand, which I think maybe they did do. But correct me if I'm wrong. But I do think, you could say self-defense, you could say she was an emotional mind, or that she was just defending herself. But actually in that exchange, they both hurt each other. Okay. And so sometimes that kind of thing can happen and it sort of minimizes the impact of the interpersonal violence in the first place. And people can kind of rationalize it away. Well, like I hurt him too, or sometimes you have to kind of defend yourself. And so that can look like aggression, right? And so it's just super complicated, very nuanced. And I think the movie does a good piece with that. It has been criticized does it sensationalize violence? Well, listen, that is something that I feel media does a lot and I'm very attuned to. I don't feel like obviously he's hot, she's hot. So watching two hot people, it is a thing. But I think they were trying to show, in my mind, like the love bombing. And when people are in these situations, it's an emotional roller coaster. It's destabilizing by definition. And so I think there's very high highs and like low lows. Often when I work with people about healing after they've escaped violent or abusive situation, safe can feel boring. And I see this sort of cycle of, in my mind, nervous system regulation. And to tie it back into pleasure psychology, it really is the piece of when our system gets wired to chaos, that's what feels normal and we seek to replicate it. And so I do believe that that is the underpinning of a lot of intergenerational trauma. Some signs to look out for around physical violence and threats is unexplained injuries, frequent accidents, or partner's aggression escalating over time. And I do think it's one of those things that if something like that does happen, you don't want to dismiss it. Now, she does a really great job in the book, in particular, about the dialogue of just, she calls him out and says, if you ever do this again, then I know that it's not an accident, it's a pattern. So I do think that sometimes people dismiss the first experience, and often that is signs of things to come. So we don't necessarily want to once is enough kind of thing. I have heard some critiques of the movie that I was talking to this lady when I went to go buy the book after the movie, and she said, yeah, they glossed over a lot of it. Like, he really did a number on her in the book. And I think that that was a really apt way of putting it. And I heard some commentary around that they maybe left some of it out, maybe to make it more palatable, but also I think were they trying to make it more relatable? Because if it's really extreme, I think people sometimes dismiss, oh, well, my relationship's not that bad. So I do think that there's some differences between the book and the movie. If you want to see me do a lazy book club, and it's probably coming, whether you want it or not, but I definitely want to do a more detailed Ryle's red flags using the one-liners in the book. Like, I've already been highlighting. She's got some good dialogue. You can tell Colleen Hoover. I actually need to research. I know she was a social worker. I don't know if she was actually a therapist, because often social workers can do many things. They don't necessarily are exclusively therapists. They can be case managers or work in NPOs, all that kind of thing. Financial control, this is a big one. Oftentimes people can't leave because maybe they're a stay-at-home mom or they don't have the finances, particularly if you're dealing with like narcissistic abuse. I do find narcissists tend to be successful. That's part of the status that they're going for. And so often they do sort of hold the purse strings there. So a lot of times they can withhold money, they can limit access to financial resources. I've often seen when people go through a divorce, blocking them from using the card. When you don't have your own financial independence, it can make it very hard to leave. So I definitely grew up with my mom saying to me, make your own money, Megan. And I do think that can be a safeguard. So often the signs here are feeling trapped due to the lack of financial independence or freedom, or not being able to work, and then being forced to ask for a basic need. So I've seen, even when it's a healthier situation, but a stay-at-home mom, a lot of times when one person is working, and I've seen stay-at-home dads too, when one person is working and the other isn't, it just creates like a power dynamic that's just inherently there because one person is bringing in the money. So I think that that can be hard, even if it's not an extreme abuse situation. The next one is blaming and gaslighting. This is where a partner blames their behavior, kind of like, you made me do it. And I think, again, they did a good job with this in the book, of particularly with that scene I just described. He is, I need my hands to work. He talks about his $1 million hands, and he's got the steadiest hand in Boston, right? So it's giving narcissistic vibes for sure. So I do think it's one of those things where, he reached his hand in, but she kind of got the blame for that. And so signs here are doubting your memory or perception, feeling confused, or even questioning your reality. And the gaslighting, as I've mentioned before in the previous ones, it just goes in deep. And then what I find is a lot of people also have a heavy dose of that from, like in the book, abusive relationships that or dynamics that happened within their family of origin, which just makes them even more susceptible to that. Because often as a child, when you're experiencing abuse, and even potentially as an adult, it feels safer in some kind of weird, twisted way to feel like it's my fault. In the case of a child, a lot of times they can't wrap their head around, my parent's an abuser, they're unstable. Instead, they go, it was me, I was bad, I deserve it. And it sort of gives you a sense of control, although in a destructive, twisted way that kind of maintains it. So do not recommend, but I do see that as a trend a lot. The gaslighting is intense, okay? And anybody can fall a victim of that, right? We see that as, pretty common even within our own society and within the media and all of that. And so something to be aware of there. The next one is explosive anger. So the partner has sudden intense outbursts over small issues, often leading to fear. So I think, again, this may or may not result in physical violence, but I think explosive anger at least can be emotionally abusive. And so again, the person tries so hard the victim or the survivor is walking on eggshells. They're, trying to be perfect so they don't make their partner mad. They might feel really scared or threatened during or after arguments. And so basically there's just a lack of safety all the way around there. And then the final one for today is cycles of apologies and promises. So there's sort of this cycle with domestic violence where it's honeymoon, and then there's escalating tensions, and then there's the blow up, and then there's the apology, the repair, and then it goes back into honeymoon. And I thought that they did some really good examples with this when she opens up to Ryle about that her parents were engaged in interpersonal violence. She talks about how she almost, in a twisted way, looked forward to it because it would result in like her dad buying her a present or trying to make it up to her as the daughter. But also there would be a period of peace or the honeymoon for a week or two. And so again, like with trauma, the wires get crossed and good feels bad and bad feels good. And it's just a very chaotic, destructive cycle. And so, of course, when someone's living through that, they're an emotional mind most of the time. And what we teach in DBT is that when you're an emotional mind, the logic just goes right out the window. If this is your brain, we get that emotional hijacking where the frontal cortex goes offline and we're just caught up in our emotions. And that's when we're in fight or flight or freeze. Now, one of the things that I think is really important to say here is when we talk about intimate partner violence or domestic violence, we really need to not ask women, why don't they leave? Okay. I have literally been on the crisis lines helping people problem solve, and there can be so many barriers to leaving. If you've ever had to fire someone or break up with a friend or break up with a relationship, like it's hard to do under the best circumstances. Imagine doing it under violent circumstances. It can be terrifying. So just to say, with these patterns, a lot of times there's abuse followed by remorse and temporary improvements, and it keeps sort of this cycle of it's not all bad all the time. And I think the movie does do a good job of showing that, because if it was all bad, you wouldn't be with the person. But often there's that honeymoon sort of repair that then eventually will lead to another episode of violence. So I hope this was helpful. I do think if you go see the movie or even read the book, it is a tearjerker. And I think it's a heavy movie, but I think they did a good job. I mean, my threshold is probably different than your average person being a trauma therapist, but I've listened to so many of these stories that it was very cathartic for me to just cry through that entire movie. And it was better than I thought it would be. And so I do think it's worth your time, and it's a great kind of cautionary tale. And I hope that if you found this video to be helpful, give me a like and subscribe. And I'm also going to do a video on resources. So if you're starting to recognize some of the signs here, we'll flash the resources at the end of this video and in the description, but we'll also do a separate video just kind of going over that. So thank you so much for watching, and catch you next time. Bye.